The convoy stops at the Syrian border checkpoint. 3 funeral trucks, black paint flaking in the desert heat, Egyptian diplomatic plates. Inside the lead vehicle, a mahogany coffin rests on steel rails. The body inside is real. An Egyptian diplomat who died of a heart attack in Damascus 2 days ago. His widow sits in the passenger seat, eyes red, hands folded over a black purse. She does not speak. The Syrian guard walks the length of the truck, boots crunching gravel. He taps the coffin once with his knuckles. Hollow sound. He waves his partner over. They exchange words in Arabic. The widow stiffens. The driver, an Egyptian embassy official, steps out slowly. He holds up the death certificate, the transit papers, the diplomatic seals. Everything is perfect. Everything is real. Except for one thing. The coffin has a false bottom, and beneath it, locked in a compartment the thickness of 3 hardcover books, are 247 pages of classified Syrian military intelligence. Radio, frequencies, troop movements, missile deployment schedules. Information that could shift the balance of the next war. The guard circles back to the coffin. He places both hands on the lid. The widow begins to cry, not fake tears, real ones, because she knows what happens if they open it, if they press too hard on the wrong panel, if they ask her to step out and watch them unload the body. The driver watches the guard's fingers. The guard watches the widow. And somewhere in the back of the 3rd truck, an Israeli intelligence officer named Eli Raviv holds his breath, listening through a concealed microphone, calculating how many seconds it will take for the entire operation to collapse. The guard lifts his hands. He nods. He waves them through. The convoy rolls forward into no man's land. 30 meters, 50. The Egyptian border post comes into view. Raviv exhales. The widow does not stop crying until they cross into Egypt. Only then does the driver glance at her and say, in Hebrew, "You did well." How did an Israeli agent end up trapped at a Syrian checkpoint, betting everything on a coffin rigged with hidden intelligence files? And how did Mossad turn funeral rites into one of the most reliable smuggling methods of the Cold War? In 1967, Israel won the Six-Day War. But winning a war and knowing what comes next are 2 different problems. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, all defeated, all furious, all rearming. The question facing Israeli intelligence was not if another war would come, it was when, and whether Israel would see it coming. Mossad had agents inside Syria. Some were long-term sleepers, some were recruited locals, some were diplomats from friendly or neutral countries who had been turned. But having agents is not enough. You need to get their intelligence out. You need to move documents, photographs, maps, recordings, physical evidence that cannot be transmitted over radio or telephone without risk of interception. The problem was the borders. Syrian intelligence, the Mukhabarat, ran every checkpoint with paranoia. They searched diplomatic bags. They x-rayed parcels. They detained couriers for hours, days, looking for anything irregular. Standard smuggling methods were burning. Mossad needed something invisible, something that no one would ever want to open, something sacred. That is when someone in the planning division remembered an old truth. Every country, every culture, every religion has one thing in common: respect for the dead. Funeral convoys get waved through borders. Coffins are not searched. Grieving families are not interrogated. It is considered deeply offensive, even sacrilegious, to interfere with the transport of a body. And that gap between cultural respect and security protocol was exactly the kind of seam Mossad knew how to exploit. The idea was simple: build a coffin with a hidden compartment. Use real bodies diplomats, travelers, nationals who had died abroad and whose families agreed to cooperate, or who never knew their loved one's casket had been modified. Load the compartment with documents. Run the coffin through borders under diplomatic or humanitarian cover. Extract the files on the other side. Repeat. It was not a new idea. Intelligence services had used coffins before. The Nazis smuggled gold in caskets during World War II. The CIA moved weapons in funeral shipments during Vietnam, but Mossad refined it. They turned it into a system, a doctrine. and for nearly a decade, coffin runs became one of the most successful and most disturbing methods of smuggling intelligence out of hostile territory. The compartment had to be invisible, not just hidden, invisible. Because if a coffin looked modified, if it felt wrong, if its weight distribution seemed off, the entire operation would collapse. Mossad's technical division worked with a furniture craftsman in Tel Aviv. Not a spy, just a man who built custom caskets for high-end funerals. He was told he was designing a prototype for diplomatic transport. He was never told what it would carry. The design was elegant. The coffin's base, normally solid wood or composite, was split into 2 layers. The bottom layer was real. It supported the body. The top layer, just beneath the padding and lining, was a false floor, 3 centimeters thick. Just enough space to hold documents, microfilm, small mechanical parts, maps folded into tight bundles. The seam where the false floor met the true base was invisible to the naked eye. It required a specific sequence of pressure points along the inner rail to release. If you did not know where to press, you could tear the coffin apart and never find it. Weight was the next problem. A coffin with a body inside weighs between 90 and 120 kilograms, depending on the deceased. Add 3 kilograms of files, and the weight changes. Not by much, but enough that a trained handler at a checkpoint might notice. So Mossad's engineers added ballast to the exterior frame, lead strips hidden in the decorative trim, extra bracing in the handles. The coffin's total weight stayed within normal range. The center of gravity stayed consistent. When lifted, it felt exactly like what it was supposed to be. A coffin with a body inside. The lining was another detail. Coffins are lined with fabric silk, satin, velvet. Mossad used a double-layered lining. The outer layer was standard. The inner layer, directly above the compartment, was bonded with a thin rubber membrane. This prevented the documents from rustling or shifting during transport. It also kept them dry. Because in the Middle East, in the summer, condensation inside a closed coffin can destroy paper in hours. Every detail mattered. The screws holding the lid were standard brass. The handles were regulation weight. The wood was Lebanese cedar or Egyptian mahogany, depending on where the body was supposed to be from. There was no detail too small to get wrong. And then came the hardest part: finding the bodies. Mossad could not use fake bodies. Checkpoint guards had seen enough death to know when something was off. A mannequin does not settle right. A weighted dummy does not compress in the same places. The body had to be real, which meant Mossad needed to identify foreign nationals, Egyptian, Lebanese, Jordanian, European, who died in Syria, or neighboring hostile states and whose bodies were being repatriated. Then they needed access to those bodies. Sometimes the family cooperated. If the deceased had been an intelligence asset, or if the family had ties to Israel, they were approached quietly. The request was framed carefully. Your loved one's body will be treated with full respect. It will be transported exactly as planned. But for a brief window, it will also serve your country. Most said yes. Some did not. When families refused, Mossad had another option. They worked with funeral directors, transport officials, and embassy staff in neutral or friendly countries. A coffin would be switched at a way station, say, a funeral home in Beirut or a diplomatic facility in Cairo. The real coffin would be held temporarily. The modified coffin, carrying the same body, would continue the journey. After crossing the border, the coffin would be switched back. The family never knew. The body was never disturbed. The documents were extracted cleanly, resealed in a diplomatic pouch, and sent to Tel Aviv. But there were complications. On one operation in 1969, a coffin carrying a deceased Jordanian diplomat was delayed at the Syrian border for 6 hours. The family was traveling in a separate vehicle. Syrian officials wanted to inspect the casket because the diplomatic seals on the truck did not match the transit paperwork. The Mossad officer traveling as a mourner had 2 options: open the coffin and risk exposure, or stall. He chose to stall. He fainted, not fake. He hyperventilated until he collapsed. The Syrians called a medic. The delay bought 30 minutes. In that 30 minutes, a second officer in the convoy bribed a junior checkpoint official to wave them through on medical grounds. It worked. But the officer who fainted spent 2 days in a Damascus hospital under surveillance, maintaining his cover as a grieving nephew. He never broke. Another operation nearly collapsed when a coffin's hidden compartment was discovered not by Syrian intelligence, but by an Egyptian customs officer in Cairo who noticed the weight felt wrong. He was about to order an inspection when the Israeli handler, posing as a diplomat, offered him a bribe, not cash, a favor. The officer had a daughter who needed medical treatment in Europe. Mossad arranged it. The officer looked the other way. The coffin crossed into Israel, the daughter got her surgery. The officer never knew the full picture. He thought he had helped a desperate diplomat smuggle currency. He had no idea he had just enabled one of the most sensitive intelligence hauls of the year. The operation that defined the coffin method took place in late 1970. A Mossad agent in Damascus, operating undercover as a journalist, had obtained blueprints of Syrian air defense installations along the Golan Heights. Radar locations, missile batteries, command bunkers, the kind of intelligence that could save hundreds of Israeli lives in the next conflict. But the blueprints were physical. 73 pages of technical drawings, folded and sealed in a waterproof case, too large to microfilm on site, too dangerous to carry on a person. They needed to be moved out of Syria within 48 hours. Syrian counterintelligence was closing in on the source. The window was collapsing. Mossad activated a contingency plan. A Lebanese-Canadian businessman had died of a stroke in a Damascus hotel 2 days earlier. His body was being repatriated to Beirut, then flown to Montreal. The family had agreed to delay the transport by 1 day for logistical reasons. That 1 day was all Mossad needed. A modified coffin was flown into Beirut, transported overland to Damascus, and swapped with the original at a funeral home that Mossad had been cultivating for 3 years. The blueprints were loaded into the hidden compartment. The body was placed inside. The coffin was resealed. The convoy left Damascus at dawn. The first checkpoint was routine. Syrian guards checked the paperwork, glanced at the widow, a Mossad officer in her 50s, fluent in Arabic, playing the role of grieving spouse. They waved the convoy through. The second checkpoint was not routine. A senior Mukhabarat officer was on site, conducting random inspections. He ordered the convoy to stop. He walked to the back of the truck. He asked the driver to open the rear door. The driver complied. The officer looked at the coffin. He asked about the deceased. The widow answered in broken Arabic, voice shaking. The officer asked to see the death certificate. The driver handed it over. The officer studied it for 2 minutes. Then he asked a question that was not on any checklist. He asked why the coffin was so heavy. The widow did not hesitate. She said her husband had been a large man, over 100 kilograms. The officer stared at her. Then he walked around the truck, looking at the tires, checking the suspension. He was calculating. The driver's hands were steady, but his heart rate spiked. Inside the third vehicle, 2 backup officers prepared to intervene if the inspection escalated. But the widow did something unexpected. She stepped closer to the officer. She said, in perfect Arabic, he died alone, in a hotel room, far from his children. If you open that coffin, I will make sure every newspaper in Beirut knows how Syria treats the dead. It was not a threat, it was a plea wrapped in social pressure. The officer looked at her, looked at the coffin, and then he stepped back. He handed the certificate to the driver. He waved them through. The convoy crossed into Lebanon 3 hours later. The coffin was transferred to a Mossad safe house in Beirut. The blueprints were extracted, photographed, and couriered to Tel Aviv within 6 hours. The body continued to Montreal. The family buried their father with full honors. They never knew what had traveled with him. 2 months later, Israel used those blueprints to plan airstrikes that crippled Syrian air defenses in the opening hours of the Yom Kippur War. The intelligence saved lives. It also raised a question that has never been answered. How many other coffins made that journey? Mossad ran coffin operations for nearly a decade. Some were one-time emergency exfiltrations, others were part of sustained networks. The method was effective because it exploited a universal taboo. But it also crossed a line that many intelligence officers, even within Mossad, found deeply uncomfortable. Using the dead as cover is not the same as using a fake passport or a dummy corporation. It involves families, grief, sacred rituals. In some cases, families were never told. In others, they were complicit but conflicted. One former Mossad officer, speaking years later, described the coffin runs as necessary, brilliant, and haunting. He said the operations worked because they relied on something no checkpoint guard wanted to confront: the possibility that by disrespecting a coffin, they might be disrespecting their own beliefs about death. But the method had limits. By the mid-1970s, intelligence agencies across the Middle East had begun to suspect that coffins were being used for smuggling. Not just by Mossad, by everyone. Arms dealers moved weapons in caskets. Drug traffickers moved heroin. Revolutionaries moved explosives. The coffin, once untouchable, became a known vector. Border inspections became more invasive. X-ray machines were deployed. Sniffer dogs were trained to detect anomalies in sealed containers. The sacred space that Mossad had exploited began to close, and with it, the operational advantage of the coffin run faded. Mossad shifted to other methods: diplomatic pouches with better seals, encrypted transmissions, dead drops in neutral cities. But the coffin operations left a legacy. They proved that intelligence work is not just about technology or networks. It is about understanding human psychology. What people will overlook, what they will not question, what they are afraid to confront. Mossad built a smuggling system around the one thing no guard wants to check. And for years, it worked. But there is another legacy, an ethical one. When you turn a funeral into an operation, you are asking families to participate in deception during their most vulnerable moment. You are using grief as cover. And while the intelligence gathered may save lives, the method raises questions that do not have clean answers. If a family agrees, is that consent freely given, or is it coerced by circumstance? If they do not know, is that protection or betrayal? And when the body of someone's father, mother, sibling, or spouse becomes a tool of statecraft, where is the line between necessity and exploitation? Mossad officers involved in coffin operations were trained to compartmentalize, to focus on the mission, to remember that the documents they were moving could prevent attacks, save soldiers, change the outcome of wars. And that is true. But it is also true that those same officers carried the weight of what they had done. Not the pride of a successful operation, something heavier. One officer, in a debriefing years later, said he still remembered the widow who cried at the Syrian checkpoint. He said he did not know if her tears were part of the cover or if they were real, and he said that not knowing was worse than if he had known for certain, because it meant he had used her grief either way. The coffin run stopped, but the questions remain. At what point does the need for intelligence justify turning the most intimate moments of human life into battlegrounds? When you recruit someone's grief, or their body, or their family's trust, are you still operating within the bounds of what intelligence work should be? And if the answer is yes because the stakes are survival, then what does that say about the cost of survival? If you were the officer at that checkpoint, holding your breath while a guard's hand rested on a coffin that carried both a body and the future of a war, would you have made the same call? And if you were the family, grieving and unknowing, would you want to know what your loved one's final journey had been used for? Or would you rather never find out? Mossad built hidden compartments in coffins because the dead are untouchable. And for years, that invisible seam between respect and security was enough to move intelligence across borders that no spy could cross alive. The method worked because it understood something fundamental about power, that the most effective disguise is not invisibility, it is something no one wants to see. If this operation opened your eyes to how real intelligence work operates in the shadows, subscribe to Hidden Ops for more true missions from the world of covert tradecraft and the decisions that shaped history from behind closed doors.